Devitalization, the problem of pursuing spirituality in an impractical way. The Spiritual Problems series by Dr. Lisa Love. In the book Esoteric Psychology Volume 2, written primarily for what Alice Bailey calls Group 7 probationary disciples, we learn about 4 major difficulties they face, known as the 4 Ds. And you can look that up if you want for yourself, pages 598 to 607, and this is going to be part of a series, not only with these 4 Ds, but other things in the Spiritual Problems series. The 4 Ds explored in this video series are known as devitalization, delusion, delirium, and detachment, which I am calling devitalization pursuing spirituality in an impractical way. That's my summary of what she's saying. Delusion, which I'm summarizing as love of fantasy versus reality. Delirium, which is fanatical obsession with one's view of spirituality, I'm calling it. And detachment, or misguided withdrawal from the world. And so those are my summaries to help you get a better understanding of what these 4 categories may be about. As a reminder for those of you who watch the Soul to Spirit YouTube channel, and if you're new to this channel, I encourage you to subscribe so you'll be aware of when new videos come out in this series. Spiritual growth does not happen in a step-by-step manner, something we've covered in previous videos on the Soul to Spirit channel. Rather, spiritual growth is like the game Chutes and Ladders, drawn from the older game known as Snakes and Ladders. And here we go up and down in our spiritual growth, because as we tend to grow, we tend to have gaps, Bailey calls them cleavages, in our development that we need to go back and clean up later. So most people, as they talk about spiritual growth, assume that you go from level 1, and maybe you kind of go neatly around this way, then level 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and reach the finish line. That's not how it goes. Rather, we may be on a certain level and have difficulties in completing the developmental task of that level for various reasons. As for when we become aware these gaps exist, that may happen shortly after we complete a certain stage of development, and here I have an example of that, where let's say maybe we're going from level 1 to level 2, and there's 10 different sub-levels on each one of these 10 levels, as we can see here, 10 different sub-levels. So let's say we go from here, and we don't have to go around this way to get here. We suddenly do a jump in development. We've learned something, we've had an experience, a state experience of some kind, and we're like, oh my God, look it, I'm already understanding and doing things on this level. And that's a relatively minor jump. But then what can happen is we're like here, we jump here, we go 3 more steps, and all of a sudden we're back down here. That's how spiritual life goes. And this is an example of just a minor difficulties between a couple levels of shift. But why I love this game as an example is we could also, here we are, level 1, 2, 3, and all of a sudden, boom, we're all the way up to level 9. Now this usually happens if we've had a really dramatic state experience of some kind, some sort of mystical experience or something. And we're like, oh my God, I understand everything. It's all amazing. I've made this gigantic spiritual leap. And then what happens? This game represents, we go 1, 2, 3, 4 more steps along level 9, let's say, or group 9 we could say, and then bam. All of a sudden, we're right back down to group 3, and we're not only right back down, we're a little bit behind where we were before. That, to me, is how spiritual life goes, and that's what I feel the Bailey books are saying as well. And the spiritual psychologist is learning how to understand and recognize if there's these gaps or cleavages in development that we need to go back and fix. Keeping these gaps in mind, let's explore what Bailey calls devitalization, or again what I've called the tendency to pursue spirituality in an impractical way. Using Bailey's words, she states that this problem comes about when, quote, we are mystically inclined, end of quote, and are, quote, prone upwards to the land of dreams, end of quote. In a positive way, we find that those who suffer from devitalization are, her quote, idealistic, end of quote, but can live, her quote again, entirely in the world of aspiration and thus neglect life on the physical plane, becoming not only impractical but negative to the physical plane. And that's the real problem. They're not able to cope, to survive. And we see this a lot with Group 7 probationary disciples. And remember, all of us have all 10 groups within us. And so we may have yet to become a Group 7 probationary disciple, or we may be beyond it and have this gap in development we have to resolve, or we may be a Group 7 probationary disciple at that particular level. This misguided aspiration causes especially Group 7 probationary disciples to draw their, quote, life force upward so that the physical body and life on the physical plane suffers, end of quote. Though probationers at this level believe they are being spiritual, Bailey states that the, quote, forces of the solar plexus are not drawn upward to the heart center as they should be, nor is the energy of the heart poured out in selfless love of humanity, end of quote. The result is that, she says, the astral body is fed and the physical body suffers grievously through this. What a word, grievously. That can let you know the austerity or harshness of the physical body or physical life. Psychologically, then, we might say that their pull towards spirituality often includes an avoidance of the world and other people, which might be due to the disposition of the personality or some trauma that made them adverse to really living in and managing people in the world more effectively around them. So part of it's the mystical inclination, but part of it can be issues developmentally that they've got a gap in, maybe at group 4 or 5, where we're being connected to other people or learning how to become experts in the world so we can make money. Maybe there's a gap at that level. And so when we get into being a Group 7 probationary disciple, the mystical inclinations being enhanced, and we think we're being spiritual, but we're really dealing with a cleavage from something that happened before when we didn't get through our recapitulation of Group 4 or 5 in a successful way. Bailey also goes on to say that a study of the lives of many saints and mystics will show how the difficulty of devitalization is seen in their lives, especially if they do not overcome devitalization and devote themselves in service of humanity. And you can find that exact quote, page 599 to 600 in Esoteric Psychology, Volume 2. What a statement. You know, there's so many classes that I've taken and things that I've seen about the lives of mystics and saints. I have a number of books on that. But it would really be interesting to go back and look at and say, wow, was this really a problem of devitalization? Interesting thing. Maybe some of you want to go do that. But if you don't want to go do that, look at some of the lives of mystics and saints and see if they were prone to devitalization. Here's an example. Though it is not the intention of this video to review the lives of various mystics and saints to discover if they were prone to devitalization or not, it is interesting to contemplate a phase in the Buddha's life where he almost starved himself to death as potentially an example of devitalization. Later, the Buddha rejected this extreme approach as unbalanced. In modern times, through both my research and my life experience with this issue, I have seen how the idealism and devotion to the spiritual path, especially of Group 7 probationary disciples, can send them into the problem of devitalization. And as a confession, I went through this period at one point in my life, overly mystical, overly impractical. There were other things that led to devitalization, some karmic circumstances I had to go through, but it is very important, especially so-called spiritual leaders or groups may even take advantage of the sacrifices Group 7 probationary disciples are willing to make, ensuring their own talents and material prosperity thrive while leaving those they have exploited struggling in the world, unable to cultivate their gifts so they can end up becoming of real service to others. This is a problem I've seen in groups, I've experienced in groups, I know other people that have had in groups, and it's a problem, especially of a group, if the leader is that way too, of Group 7 probationary disciples. Or it could be somebody that's maybe a group 6 materialist or group 6 aspirant that aren't that serious about spirituality, or group 6 materialist would pretend to be spiritual and really just be using it to manipulate people. Group 6 aspirant would have more desire to be spiritual, but they don't really want to give up their goodies, so they could grab a hold of group 7 probationary disciples and their mystical tendencies that were prone to devitalization and get them to sacrifice their livelihoods, their well-being, their careers, and that leader gets all the goodies, so-called spiritually, quote unquote spiritually, and the group 7 probationary disciple is left with a lot of spiritual wounding after all of that. So now that I've given you a bit of an overview of the problem of devitalization, let's look at a few ways to prevent it. Having been exposed, as I said, to exploitative types of so-called spiritual leaders and groups, I was able later in my life in my degree programs in transpersonal psychology to do research to see how long-established and reputable spiritual organizations treated those within their spiritual organizations instead. And the first thing I learned was how much screening went on to see if people were truly ready for the rigors of spiritual life. If people were not ready, the aspiration and devotion, especially of younger people — I was in my mid-20s when I fell into this problem — the aspiration and devotion was redirected into insisting that that person find meaningful work and maybe even live the life of a householder, pursuing more karma and bhakti yoga type practices. Karma is service, bhakti is devotion, and leaving the more intense spiritual practices till later. In the Bailey teachings, we would call this making sure that people had successfully completed the task of groups 4, 5, and 6, so that people had a good foundation to begin a more rigorous spiritual life. We would take time as esoteric or spiritual psychologists to do the screening and say, what's your family history like? What's your family network like? Do you have friends? Do you have a support system? Do you have spiritual wounding along those lines? That would be a group 4 gap in development. Group 5, do you have some expertise in an area? Are you developing that expertise? You could help use their Ray makeup, their astrology. If you want, you could borrow the Enneagram from a different system, Myers-Briggs, etc. How are you doing in terms of understanding what your unique talents and skills are and making sure that you're developing in them? If they're not doing that, that could be a group 5 spiritual difficulty. Are you feeling confident in the world and in yourself? Do you have what we would call in the West now good self-esteem, so that you know you can go out and be a success in the world and be of use? If not, that's a group 6 problem. And too often what we see in group 7 probationary disciples, speaking about my own life as well, is that mysticism, that idealism draws us into spiritual groups and organizations who aren't doing proper screening, who aren't looking for the gaps in our development, who aren't directing us in the right way of filling in those gaps in our life first and giving us the appropriate tools in our spiritual development until we're ready to take on more serious practices. Instead, as we mentioned before, irreputable spiritual organizations will exploit you on that and use you for your idealism, your mysticism, your money, and end up devitalizing you in the process. And we want to prevent that. And one of the best ways to do it is good screening of your own life and screening of other people, and understanding if you've been screened out of an organization, there might be a good reason for that, and try and understand how to fill in those gaps in your own life. So this slide is a summary of what I've just said essentially, but let's go over it again. By making sure the developmental task of groups 3, 4, 5, and 6, group 3 is I want to be a hero somehow. By making sure those developmental tasks are met, the likelihood of gaps occurring, or again cleavages as Bailey calls them, are diminished. And the developmental tasks of groups 3, 4, 5, and 6 include developing a sense of self-esteem, and knowing one's worth in order to prevent being taken advantage of. That's like group 3, I want to be a hero. Building healthy and loving bonds with others so that as they progress along the spiritual path, they're more likely to have a positive support group. That's a developmental task, especially of group 4 and to some effect also of group 5. And a healthy spiritual organization knows how to build healthy, loving bonds within that spiritual community. If that's not going on, there's going to be gaps in the development, and some of the 4Ds and other spiritual problems that we're going to talk about in later videos will develop within that spiritual group or organization, which is not healthy and conducive to the overall service work that that group or organization is trying to do. That's why I'm doing this Spiritual Problems series, to help you understand things I've learned from mistakes in my own life, as well as from all the training that I've received as a spiritual esoteric transpersonal psychologist. Another one is discovering what your unique talents and gifts are. That's a group 5 milestone, and learning how to use them effectively in the world, especially in service to others, until one becomes a group 6 aspirant. These are group 6 challenges. And it's interesting because we're going to get to prevention, and one of the things we're going to hear is that you might want to encourage that group 7 probationary disciple who's got devitalization to become a little more agnostic. I think that's also in the video I'm doing on delusion coming up as well here. And why do I say that here? Because group 6 materialists tend to be agnostic or atheistic, which is a natural developmental stage getting out of group 3, 4, and 5, their tendency to be mythologically and magical thinking orientated into more clear thinking. And so you might want a group 7 probationary disciple who's overly mystical, perhaps falling into magical thinking, hasn't come out of mythological thinking enough because of gaps in development in those groups, to go back and do some work on themselves. And agnosticism or even atheism might be a good approach temporarily. If these basics are not met, then it would be better to shift the focus of the person's life into psychological, relationship, or career counseling to help the person make sure they are really prepared for more rigorous spiritual practices and a fuller dedication to spiritual life. Now, again, I got exposed to different kinds of spiritual groups later on in my life, and I found groups perfectly willing to say, go away, come back later to people, because they weren't in it for the money. They weren't in it to try and get the status or the fame or to spread the teachings. They were in it to find good, qualified candidates that really could enter into discipleship practices in a mature and healthy way to advance their own spiritual growth and to be of service in the world. And that's what we really want. As my research continued, I also talked to people in various spiritual lineages, mainly Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist, about how they prevented devitalization with their spiritual communities. And again, there was a heavy emphasis on screening for readiness and a willingness, as I just said, to send people away who needed to do more work on themselves before engaging in a deeper spiritual life. But beyond this, I learned a lot from nuns and monks I talked to, both from Eastern and Western traditions, who shared how those in their communities were given a life of financial stability, even if it involved living simply, plenty of healthy food and exercise, regular spiritual practice on the path, and a strong support system to help them progress through the ups and downs they were likely to face in spiritual life in their quest to know the self or God. So healthy spiritual organizations fundraise or do things so that you can make money while you live within their organization. You can make enough money to buy a home of your own and live within the organization if you're not being a monastic, living a very, very simple life and just having a room. You're given plenty of wonderful food, encouragement to exercise, and to do different practices to keep the body in great shape. That could include also things like Tai Chi or Paramahansa Yogananda's Self-Realization Fellowship energization exercises that help you in terms of knowing how to keep the energy body clean and pure. You're given guidance along the way. I was fortunate I got a number of classes that I took in my transpersonal psychology degree program on spiritual guidance, and I learned a lot about how these communities offer guidance to the people within their communities, and a strong support system and a really healthy spiritual community, of which I discovered a few, know how to problem solve when the different personalities within a spiritual community are going to have difficulties, and that's pretty much always going to happen. And so if you've got a really healthy spiritual community, they have built-in ways of knowing how to deal with that. So now I'm going to give a shout out to a couple organizations that I thought were handling things well. And one example of this was the Yogaville Ashram of Guru Swami Satchidananda. In this spiritual community, both householders and monastics, which are also known as sannyasi, were found. Those in the ashram were given jobs that matched their talents, decent wages that even allowed them to buy a modest home, plenty of healthy food. They were given health care, a support system, counseling services, both spiritual and psychological, and outlets to cultivate not only their inner spiritual lives, but their outer talents, which they channeled into service activities to benefit others. And if people decided to leave the community, because people did, they weren't all happy with that lifestyle, even though they got a lot of perks. Even if they were dissatisfied because they wanted more of a worldly life than the ashram provided, they did not feel damaged in their ability to make a living and be of service in the world as they did so. Now, maybe there's a few outliers I haven't been exposed to that did feel damaged, but in overall, my understanding of the community and the various people I talked to was that they felt that they were given a really decent life there and were given lots of support if they chose to leave as well. Here's another example of an Eastern type organization, and that is my experience with Self-Realization Fellowship founded by Paramahansa Yogananda, who came to the United States in 1920. After enrolling so I could receive the lessons given out by Yogananda, I have to say I was amazed to discover how much of an emphasis was laid on leading a practical spiritual life. One full lesson even gave out very specific guidelines about living the life of spiritual balance. The lesson reviewed the importance of staying in balance concerning business, family, relationships, finances, and other areas of life. And practical questions were even given to help one understand if they were truly living a balanced spiritual life or not. Now, I am aware of certain websites where people talk about that they didn't have the best experience with Self-Realization Fellowship, etc. Like any organization, it's gone through different kinds of presidents, leaderships. Like any organization, there's a mixture of personalities, and no group is going to be perfect. My point here is, within that organization, given out to everybody who wants to enroll for the lessons, there is a prescription, so to speak, of how to prevent devitalization and many of the other spiritual problems. And if you as an individual are following the prescription that they're giving out, most likely you're going to prevent these spiritual difficulties. And of course, it's up to you to take the responsibility to do that. And if you're not working with somebody directly, then it's up to you to also realize if you have some gaps in your own development that need to get filled. To let you know, my research even led me into reading about the lives of gurus and lamas who were, maybe we could say, a little more extreme here. They weren't out in the world. They were doing 2 to 10-year retreats in caves. I wanted to figure out, well, what about devitalization with those cave people, those monks and lamas and gurus we hear about that are off in the Himalayas somewhere? Well, to my surprise, I discovered that those doing spiritual practice in caves were given a lot of support. Regularly, they received food and supplies, along with frequent spiritual instruction and review of their progress to make sure they were on the right path. They were given a series of techniques that they were doing, and they were being guided and mentored by people who would come up, check on them, see what they were doing, adjust their techniques, give them something new once they'd reached certain milestones, etc. I also learned that it was common for them to be kicked out of their caves to go out in the world and serve. It's like you've graduated from your university training in the cave, get out there. That service usually included teaching and training others, but it may also include, I was really surprised to find this out, fundraising, having to run an organization suddenly, and handling a multitude of tasks that some even said made living in a cave seem way easier. Brings me back to what Bailey is saying about solar plexus to the heart. Are you doing this spiritual practice simply for your own solar plexus, will, purpose, power, spiritual advancement? Or are you doing it so that you can be of true service to humanity in Buddhism? You know, you start everything by saying the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the community, the well-being of others. You know, the dedication through the heart center of service, of love. Are we approaching our spiritual practice in that way? One example, I have to say, and I was so delighted to find this person, he still almost brings tears to my eyes whenever I see his picture, is His Holiness Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who many regard as a living Buddha of our modern times. And I have to say, to me, I might fall in that category. He was so amazing. One of the main teachers of the current Dalai Lama, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, spent many years in caves doing spiritual practice. He often went back into a cave for a period of time and then came back out and served and then went back in. Fortunately, he also spent a substantial amount of time teaching. It is even said by some that many of the most sacred teachings of Tibet might have been lost had Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche not fled the country when Tibet was invading the Chinese to continue to teach in Burma. He was a living example of the teachings, as well as had studied in many of the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism and really understood the synthesis of the many different traditions. And thank God he wasn't just one of those gurus or monks or lamas that just wanted to be in a cave, and instead he fully developed his heart center and spread that Dharma, those blessings, out into the world for the rest of us. So jumping back to the West, remember my research, and it was actually a PhD dissertation on wealth and spirituality that I was going through because of my own problems with devitalization in my life, both because I had been naive and taken advantage of by a particular spiritual group and some of my own wounding from my earlier childhood, gaps in my own development, and also some karmic circumstances, you might want to say. So during that research, I was surprised as I found dozens of examples of revered spiritual people who had very practical and successful lives before going into spiritual service. Again, they were demonstrating to me that they were at least a Group 6 aspirant before starting on the spiritual path. And one example that stood out to me was Mother Teresa, who I discovered was raised in a relatively well-off, or some might say well-off, and loving family that gave her a good foundation to become a respected and highly effective administrator of a school. She was definitely a Group 6 aspirant before starting on the spiritual path. By the time she was called to help the homeless, she had developed a solid inner emotional and psychological core. I also found out she was not just a nun in Calcutta helping the poor in a homeless shelter. Throughout her life of service, she was a dynamo who raised millions of dollars a year. I think at one point I read it was $30 million a year on average. Now, I didn't put that in here exactly because I have to go find that quote again and make sure it was right. But I remember it was millions of dollars a year that she fundraised for her Sisters of Charity organization, effectively acting as an administrator of a worldwide organization. In effect, she was a CEO, we might say. So in conclusion, spiritual life is ultimately about self-realization. But in addition, that self-realization needs to be combined with service to others, or else spirituality becomes merely a selfish quest. And how spiritual is that really? So to achieve them both, a balance between self-realization and service needs to exist. To maintain that balance, some may live simply and still be very effective. But most must find a way to provide for themselves in the world while discovering and then using their gifts effectively to service and to others, service to others. Now, I have examples in my head as I'm reading this of various people, but I don't want to digress and get into that. This video is actually getting way too long as I'm wrapping it up. But maybe in the future, I'll do some shorter videos on examples of these kinds of people. To maintain that balance, an in-depth examination into one's motives for being on the spiritual path needs to take place. That's why I recommend Group 7 probationary disciples, or even if you're beyond that stage, go back and review the rules for probationers. I've done a video on each one here. And one of them, starting out at the very beginning, is to go back into the heart's deep cave and ask, why am I really on this spiritual path? But here's some other questions to answer. Are you living simply to avoid developing the muscles that allow you to serve effectively in the world? I mean, is spirituality just a form of escapism to you because it's too hard out there? That's not really spirituality, and that's going to lead to the 4 Ds and more in this series. Just as I said, are you truly wanting to help others or just escape responsibility? Are you fulfilling your karmic duties to those around you as best you can, or neglecting them while claiming to be spiritual because it's too hard to deal with that karma that you've been dealt? So you just want to find a way to run away from it. It's too hard to make a living in the world, etc. So you just want to ignore it, claim to be spiritual, and try and get other people to give you money because you're spiritual. Do you practically know what gifts you have to offer and how best to put them to use? If not, what kinds of things can you do to get yourself aware of that? I think of another thing, Now Discover Your Strengths, is a book I found particularly useful, as well as the 7 Rays, esoteric astrology. You could also, again, do the Enneagram, the Myers-Briggs. There's many tools out there. Do you know what your skill set is? Do you know how to put your skills to use? Are you giving as much of yourself as you can in service in a way that avoids devitalization? Because devitalization isn't going to help you or anybody else. In the end, it's going to blow out your base of the spine chakra, and it means that you're not going to be grounded. You're not going to be able to be in the world and not of it. And hey, how do I know? I speak from experience. Fortunately, I recovered. So, especially if you're an idealistic, mystical type and you're watching this video, when you encounter others who might be attracted to your aspiration and devotion, are you aware of how they may take advantage of your good heart but potential lack of wisdom? I wasn't in my mid-20s. That's one of the reasons I ran into difficulty. Can you spot if someone supposedly on a spiritual path is trying to get you to do things for them that benefits them, but is detrimental to your overall psychological well-being and capacity to serve in the world? If you're not aware of this, go get some help from somebody that can give you some guidance, and hopefully this video is helping you as well. Do so-called spiritual people or groups try to convince you to do things for free at the expense of you being able to fulfill your responsibilities to yourself, people you are meant to care for, and your service? Remember, reputable spiritual organizations, they don't do that. You may do some things for free, but they will guide you in such a way that they make sure you are not becoming devitalized or hurting your ability to serve and develop your gifts and talents later in your life. And if you're a spiritual leader and you're watching this or part of a spiritual community, are you wise enough to screen people to ensure that they are ready for deeper spiritual work? I mean, a truly legitimate spiritual organization, I've learned, does that. They're more than happy to say goodbye to people who aren't ready. Do you channel the spiritual idealism and devotion of the people that come to you in such a way that they're not taken advantage of financially, emotionally, or otherwise? That was part of some of my degree classes I took in spiritual wounding, where I learned from other people's dissertations that they were doing to people that had been sexually taken advantage of, emotionally damaged, etc. And fortunately, in the transpersonal and integral psychology movements, there's more and more awareness of this dynamic out there, and some really excellent books you can get to try and make sure that spiritual leaders aren't doing this, or if you're a spiritual leader, to make sure you and those in your community aren't doing it as well. If you do accept a person into your spiritual community, are you willing to invest in that person as much as you expect that person to invest in you. Otherwise, there's an imbalance and a power dynamic, and that's a danger as well in a spiritual community. Is that person becoming more wise, loving, inclusive, harmless, and capable of service in the world because of their association with you and your spiritual community and group? That's how you avoid fanaticism and cults and all the other kinds of difficulties that are going to have to be overcome because they cause gaps and cleavages in development later on as we're trying to move up the path. We'll just end up falling down a chute and being further behind than we were before if we don't handle these things well as we go along the way. These are just a few questions to make sure devitalization does not occur. Make sure you answer them well. So this spiritual problems series continues, and it's primarily for Group 7 probationary disciples. And if you want to know when the videos come out, subscribe to this channel or when other videos come out. That's the best way to know what's going on. You can also do a little alert. And the credits, this was created and narrated by me, Dr. Lisa Love. Here's where I got the photos. Here's where I got the videos. Though there were no videos in this particular series, and are you enjoying this? Are you watching a lot of these videos? Then it really does help to support this work. If you do, I have a lot of perks for you, and honestly, I only have maybe a handful of patrons. I mainly do this as a service activity. Now that my life is grounded and balanced, if my life wasn't grounded and balanced, I would not be doing this for free. I would honestly be charging some money for it because I've learned there's nothing wrong with getting paid for some of your efforts, but I do choose to do this for free. If you want to be a patron to help support it along the way, I really am motivated by my patrons. They're the main reason I keep going, and I very much enjoy talking to them. And you can also visit the website. You can subscribe, like, comment, and share. And most of all, thanks for watching, and I really hope this video is of use to you.